Hi, friends. We're back talking about Africa, specifically ancient Africa. And so, with this video, I'm going to put it above the slideshow. I'll embed the slideshow so you can kind of do both at the same time. The slideshow will sit, if you go into the modules, see how good my internet's working today. It's going to bop around here. Come on. Anyways, let's see. Come on. Oh, of course. Technology. Gotta love it. There we go. Okay, so this is under the ancient. That's not the order they're going to be in, but um, so the slideshow is going to live right here, and then the video is going to be right here. So there are going to be parts in this where we come across a video that's going to be embedded in the slideshow, and so usually you're going to want to stop and take a minute to look that over. Okay, so talking about again ancient Africa. Africa is a tough one because the main reason it's so tough is because a lot of our histories are Eurocentric. What that means is we talk about Europe and white people a lot, whereas Africa doesn't get a lot of notice. And I wish I could give it its due justice because it's a fascinating continent and it has some fascinating histories. Um, One such history, or one such barrier, I should say, is that it's huge, right? So as you can see on the screen, the true size of Africa is absolutely massive. So you can get the United States, Spain, France, Germany, all up in the what we'd call the northern and western parts of Africa. The middle is taken up by China and the other little chunk of China, right? So if I mean, you are chopping and mixing just to make it fit, but you can see India is a massive country, but it only takes up the Horn of Africa. The UK is roughly the size of Madagascar. It is a giant, giant area. It's actually bigger. So if you look at the totals over here, the total size of Africa is actually bigger than all of these put together. So if you took out some of these, blank spaces and things, it would actually end up being bigger. On the sides, you can kind of see the single countries and pieces. So America with Europe in there, with India in there, Japan, China as a whole. So they chopped part of China off, but it still fits easily inside of Africa. All right. So the size is a barrier. The other thing is that it is because it's so big and it has such a diverse geographic and climate map, we often break it into five different zones. So we kind of talk about North Africa, we talk about West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and then Madagascar is kind of off on its own. If we kind of break that into bits, why do we talk about them like that? Basically, I'm going to go over here first because this kind of helps explain a little bit better. But climate-wise or geographic-wise, we have the Sahara Desert, which really dominates the northern part. We do have the Atlas Mountains right on the border with the Mediterranean Sea. Then we have this transition zone and the Sahel. And then we have the Sahara that kind of takes up some space here. Then that transitions into tropic rainforest. We have a very mountainous region right here, some of the tallest mountains in the continent. Mount Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro. Kilimanjaro is pretty popular. Lake Victoria is right here. Lake Tanganyika is right here. And then you, again, transition into savanna with the Kalahari Desert. And Namib Desert is sometimes called right here, or on the edge, sorry. And the climates kind of match these zones. So you can see it's very dry. It's a little bit wet, tropical wet, very tropical rainforest, again, kind of wet. So these are the grasslands in the orange, and semi-arid goes around the desert here, with this part being kind of a marine west coast, so almost like, I don't know, a continent or a climate similar to maybe, I don't know, Washington, state of Washington, Oregon, that kind of thing. We're going to talk about mostly today, and unfortunately, a lot of the histories have been lost for Central and South of Africa. I'm not an expert by any stretch. We're going to talk about it a bit, but most of the ancient histories that we know and we talk about come from northern Africa into Western Africa, Mali, Timbuktu, the city of Timbuktu, that kind of thing. Most of these countries, well, all these countries are fairly new, as in most places around the world. After colonialism, things changed significantly from before colonialism, during colonialism, and then how everything shook out after those colonizing countries left. All right, so big country or big continent, very diverse cultures. There's mountains, rivers, valleys, big physical divisions. The geography really does shape the cultures. I'm not going to read off things as you see it. If you want to look through the slideshow, by all means. And that's part of the reason I do this. Not everybody wants to listen to my voice the whole time, but I do add some things that might be on the quiz that isn't directly put in the slides. So one of the ways we can talk about cultures is the art, right? So obviously Africa is a huge place, very diverse. There's small populations set in little towns, cities, wherever they might be when they have access to appropriate resources. But they oftentimes actually had some limited interaction. I mean, there are trade routes in the northern parts, but through the middle of Africa, part of the deal there is that it was tough to move from one spot to another. It's very mountainous, very the jungle had made it difficult for people to move. So we're going to divide it up a little bit. We got northern Africa, so that's what we talked about on the top. The obviously the northern part of Africa. Sorry. Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa to the east. So that's, as you look at it, that's on the right-hand side. Ancient Egypt, so obviously that's northern Africa. And then the southern part of the Sahara Desert. That's where we're talking about Mali and things like that. And in ancient Africa, that was a big trade route. So you go from the western shore on the Atlantic Ocean across and into the Middle East, and goods and things went that way. Mostly salt, but there was quite a bit of things that were traded, and we'll talk about that in a bit. All right, so materials for art. Now we're talking, centuries ago, 2 centuries ago, give or take, and most of the things that they made were in wood, right? But if you were to make, a sculpture out of wood right now, the odds of it lasting 2,000 years, pretty low. So most of the things we have from that time period, because they did start to cast with bronze and work with iron a little bit, are those exact materials. So you can see a couple examples. We've got the culture, the people of Benin were big bronze casters, so they had bronze statues quite a bit that survived. This is from the Zimbabwe area. I believe actually these two were from that area. There are some ceramics and things that, I have a runaway slideshow here. There we go. And ivory also, because, from elephants and things. But that was a little more rare. But they did obviously use the tusks from elephants and to make some art. All right. So, whoops. God, man, I'm having all sorts of issues. There we go. Having all sorts of issues. Technology. All right. So, a big common trait through all of these is the three-dimensional art. So, there was always more sculpture, more mass, jewelry, pottery, that kind of stuff. And it wasn't necessarily painting. They did, paint on walls and things like that, but oftentimes that was on a wooden wall, which had a hard time surviving. Especially, a lot of populations lived in, either the northern Africa part or in more tropical environments where things didn't, nature tended to take over quite fast. Sculpture was usually the most important part of the art, and they used the human form quite a bit. Masks were also important because they were not only art, but they were used in performance art. So when they got together to celebrate, they were, dances and stuff, and they would wear the mask, and jewelry as well. So a lot of it was more useful art, I guess would be the way to put it, but it was certainly very highly decorative, highly, a lot of time spent on it. As you can see, this is, somebody spent a great deal of time putting that together. Here's an example of a mask. It's not it was the best picture I could find because it was well lit and the resolution was good, but it isn't a good example of the detail and the craftsmanship that they could do. This is a little more plain. There's an example of some jewelry with some bronze and some beads that they were. I think maybe those are stones. Some of those are stones, and then of course the pottery. All right, as I mentioned, they used human form a lot, so they would oftentimes mix humans with animals as a representation. It wasn't necessarily natural. This is one of the few times where things were a little more abstract. Oftentimes, most of their art was depicting either everyday life or maybe exaggerations of everyday life. But obviously, this one has a woman as a kind of like a, I don't know, I guess when I look at it, I think of a mermaid, but a fish torso or fish legs and then a female's head and torso. Now, of course, Northern Africa is really famous for some of its bigger things. So we call them monumental art in architecture. So the really big buildings, really big structures. Some of the more famous, obviously, are the pyramids, but that's not really art, but that's big structure. The Sphinx. Now that kind of goes along with the pyramids, where it's almost a religious thing, where it was sun god and protection and things like that. But obviously, would be considered art as well, as far as the when it was originally formed. It was quite amazing. I mean, still, I haven't been, but I've heard it's amazing in person as far as the size. It is really neat. I should have done this. I don't know why I'm just thinking of it now as we're talking, but you can do a 3D walking virtual tour. It's really quite cool, even just on your computer screen. I believe it's through National Geographic, but if you type in virtual tour of the Sphinx, you can walk all around it and look up and down and around, and it is quite neat. Now, you have a rather tall obelisk here at Aksum in Ethiopia, so that's on the kind of the eastern side. Now we've got the Great Mosque in Djinn in Mali, so that's again on the western side. This is all made of mud, and it's a just absolutely enormous structure, but it's entirely made of mud. This one is the rock cut church, right? This again is in Ethiopia. Um, so actually not too far from the obelisk, but this one, as you can see, this whole pit was once rock, and they cut the whole church out of there. Actually, this has been in a few movies. Kind of a famous location. All right, so on to daily life. Now, we're talking, 1,500 years ago. Now, we're not going before the time of Christ, before the time of Abraham, but in general, we're talking about 2,000 years ago. So, breaking down the different groups, you've got farmers. So most people were farmers. Most of them just worked the land. They grew crops like yams, so sweet potatoes, sorghum. It's kind of like, I don't know how to. I don't know if you're probably not familiar with it, but it's kind of like corn that doesn't have the ears of corn, and the leaves are what you want, and it's short. So it's probably like waist high, but they have big, broad leaves that are kind of greeny. And then barley and wheat, obviously, that's more of a common thing that you can probably visualize. Some people did fish for food. There were, herds of livestock, things like that. Obviously, when you're taking care of animals, you need access to food for them, but also water was a big source. So river basins, long rivers, that kind of thing, was high concentrations of population. Traders were very important. It was actually kind of a tradition for a large part of them to just go through caravans using camels and trade with different. And they were the connections. They brought news. They brought politics sometimes, but also any inventions and things that went from one place to another as far as moving their culture along and mixing the cultures with others. Artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, tailors, toolmakers, again, they would make something, or maybe they'd invent something, but then the traders would take it to the next town over, that kind of thing, or maybe even, hundreds of thousands of miles, or not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of miles. Um, and remember that, just if you look at America, it's 3,000 miles from one side to the other, east to west, and it fit in up, that's vertically, but from the northern tip of Africa to the southern tip is almost 6,000 miles, so it's almost double the width of America. So some of these were traveling quite a long ways. There were professional warriors, but they were usually more like policemen for most areas. They didn't. There was a few. Obviously, when you live next to each other and you see, the neighbors having some good stuff, sometimes there was conflict because of that. Maybe they had better water sources or things like that that were vital to people. But in general, when you look at the histories, the actual fighting wasn't omnipresent, I guess would be a way to put it. Um, they did actually have slaves, so slavery was a thing in Africa. So if an enemy tribe maybe went to war, they would sometimes take slaves. And also criminals, if they were caught stealing, caught doing other things, they would sometimes be put into slavery as well for their punishment. It wasn't pervasive, it wasn't everywhere, but it did happen. And that's part of what contributed to the slave trade to the Americas, is that sometimes tribes would take other tribes and sell them into slavery. Um, but I don't want that to be the main narrative, because it isn't, certainly, like I said, pervasive, but it did happen. All right, daily life. So we have types of homes. Most of them, were building with what they had, and they had a lot of mud. They had a lot of hay, grass, that kind of stuff. So usually they were a mixture of that. And if you've ever seen one, they're incredibly efficient as far as keeping out the heat, which was an important part, because most of Africa is hot. They ate foods that were kind of based on where they lived. So if they lived by the coast, they ate a lot of fish. If they lived in the tropical rainforest, they tended to eat more vegetables that they were able to grow, maybe some meat that they were able to hunt, whatever it might be. If you're near the savannah, obviously gazelle hunting, I've never been, but I can imagine it's not easy, especially when you didn't have a rifle to hunt with. Um, Now, what they wore, usually because it's so warm, they barely wore much of anything. Think of the beach. If you've ever been to a beach on a hot day, you don't really want to wear much other than your swimsuit. Well, they were kind of the same situation the whole time. Now, obviously, when important events, ceremonies, things like that came up, yeah, they'd probably put on some finery and wear some jewelry, seashells, feathers, things like that. Now, so a few random facts, and I don't know, I like little factoids. I'm kind of a fan of Jeopardy. So, yams were used in West Africa to make a staple food called fufu. And fufu would be rolled into a ball and then dipped into soup for flavor. So you just basically taking that sweet potato and dipping it into soup for some flavor. Children were considered adults by the age of 12 generally, and obviously it varied a little bit by tribe or by area. But yeah, just by 12, you were usually an adult, and girls were usually married, and fathers generally chose the husband. That was the way of things. Musicians and storytellers were called griots, so we're going to talk a little bit more about them because that's a pretty important part. They often traveled with caravans, or if they didn't travel with caravans, they were representatives of their particular city or tribe. Um, so griots were storytellers, and they're a big part of especially in Western Africa. So they were their main job was to entertain. Um, so they'd tell stories, they'd sing songs. They most of them were about kings or heroes from the past. Some of the stories had like morals, what we might call fables if you're more on the religious end of things. But they used to teach children about good behavior. They didn't necessarily have, schools at this point, but this was a way of passing down tradition and stuff like that. And oftentimes griots were considered a historian in that way. So they'd keep track and memorize histories. They'd sing about births, deaths, marriages, droughts, wars, kind of all the important events in the area, wherever they might be. And then if somebody came to their village, they would be entertained by the griot. Now, they did have some instruments, and we'll talk a little bit about those. They're kind of fun. So this is a part where you might want to pause this video and then go to the slideshow and then watch this video about playing the balafon. And that's one of the instruments that they had made back then. Looks a little bit like a xylophone. Here's another video. Come on. Nope. That's not what I meant to do. There we go. Here's the kora. So here's another video, and you can watch it. This one's really short. It's about a minute long, but it is a kind of a stringed instrument with a deeper bass here that you can listen to. And pause this video. And let's see. Wants to make me play it. All right. Let's see. There we go. So the griot tradition carried through even into modern day Africa, especially in Western Africa, like countries such as Mali, Senegal, New Guinea. So most of the popular musicians play them or consider themselves griots, but they also, it's kind of, I would recommend it. I don't know. I use Amazon Music, so sometimes things like this is not always easy to get, but I know SoundCloud is a good way of getting some of this music. But if you just type in Western African music or African music, you'll notice a lot of the traditional rhythms in even today's music, which is pretty cool. Most griots were men, but women could be griots, right? If you're a woman griot, you're specialized in singing. You didn't necessarily play an instrument, but that doesn't mean you couldn't do both. So they were actually strangely considered kind of a low-ranking caste. If you now remember, a lot of civilizations around the world have a kind of a caste system. The African caste wasn't rooted so firmly in not allowing one caste to rise, a son or a daughter to rise out of that caste. Like in India, back, a couple hundred years, it was very difficult for a person born into a low caste to rise to any other caste, or if you were, a ruling family member or of the upper class, you almost never were lowered. It was very rigid. The African caste system wasn't quite so. It wasn't really that rigid. It was more of just how much deference maybe somebody would be paid. So a griot was important, but they weren't necessarily treated specially. I guess that would probably be a good way to say it. There is a little note where it's something called the Ngani instrument. It sounds like it probably was the forebearer of the banjo, which is kind of a nice little interesting nugget. All right, so it's hard to talk about Africa, especially North Africa, without talking about Islam. So when we're talking about Islam around 600 CE, so that is about 600 years after Jesus, there was a Prophet Muhammad, and he died in 632. And then the Arabs began expanding, that religion, and they first invaded in 647 in North Africa. So about 15 years after Muhammad's death, they conquered much of the land. And now they came back. Now they expanded a little bit too far, overstretched themselves, and then the Africans took back their land. So the Arabs came back in 665, so 20 years later, give or take, 18 years later. I mean, obviously, these things don't start and stop on exact dates, but they came back and they really did control pretty much all of North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to from Morocco and all the way over to Egypt, right? Um, they did continue to fight for several, 40, 50 years against the Byzantine army and the Berbers for many years. But as a result, because they were there for 50 years and kind of sprinkled in, they had kind of taken root, and Islam is really a big part of the Northern African culture. So here on the left here, we have kind of the um, early map. So this color is where Islamic territory upon Muhammad's death in 632. And then shortly after that, so the next 30 years, this part is where they started to expand. I mean, if you can think about taking all that land in 30 years, that's significant, right? And then let's say the next 60 years after that, they expanded into what we call Central Asia and all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And most impressively, or not maybe impressively, but for the discussion we're going to have here, they became they took over most of Spain and Portugal, and these were called the Moors here, which is kind of an important piece. The map on the right kind of talks about modern day. So right now we've got the green is what would be considered majority Islam. The purple is majority Christian. And then you've got kind of a mix of Christian / folk religions. So maybe more traditional religions at this point. Yeah. Now, this area that they took over with the Arabs, and I know I'm running long on this video, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. It's called the Maghreb, and it's kind of important because they all kind of share a similar culture, a similar, I don't know, a similar outlook. They're generally Islamic. They've generally fought against Europeans, and the Berbers, and so they've kind of bonded, I guess. I don't know how to say it the right way. Oops. But, oops. All right, let's try this again. Okay. But they kind of go together, and you could also include the southern part of Spain here and Portugal in this. The reason I'm mentioning it is because they're really the Moors were a big cultural influence during this time, and so they were that was the people from the Maghreb. Okay, so they're called Moors, and so they invaded Spain and parts of Italy, and so by 711 they had invaded quite a bit of Europe. There's a pretty famous general, Tariq ibn Ziyad. Um, so they did capture much of the Iberian Peninsula, that's Portugal and Spain, and they held it for hundreds of years. So you're thinking about 711, right? And they were held it for almost over 700 years, and it's kind of considered a golden age. Now this is pretty early doors, and then you're getting into Middle Ages kind of thing. And most people think about the Middle Ages as a very dark, very unintellectual time, very brutal, I guess would be the way to put it. A feudal system with a king, and it was a very top-down kind of thing where everybody paid taxes and owed allegiance to whatever regent was in the area. Um, the Moors were the exception, right? So they ruled Spain for about 800 years. They took, and they were, because they're at a crossroads with North Africa and Spain, they took all the best science things from the Arabian Peninsula and the Arabian region or Arab region, and brought them into Europe and mixed with some of the knowledge there. They brought, astronomy, chemistry, physics, especially mathematics. They brought the Arabic numerals. I can't talk. So Cordova was kind of the main capital. It was a modern city at this point, and we're talking about 1,000 years ago, where they had raised sidewalks for people to walk on. They had night lights for people to walk at night. And this is like hundreds of years before Paris, London, any other place in the world really had something like this. Education was universal, so everybody went to school. 99% of the population could read. Now, if you went to France at the same time, the French king couldn't read, which is kind of crazy. Uh, in Europe, only two universities existed, and I believe one was in Paris and one was in London. I'm suddenly having doubts about that, but the Moors had 17 universities just in the Iberian Peninsula. Well, there was some, down in the northern part of Africa as well. Um, but it was, kind of a crazy, crazy thing. 10th and 11th centuries. So again, we're talking about 900 to 1000 CE. They had 70 libraries, whereas Europe didn't have any. And Cordova had a library with 600,000 manuscripts. So we're talking crazy, um, kind of an enlightened period for these people, while the rest of the continent was struggling in darkness and through the Middle Ages. Um, they did, like I said, they brought in Arabic numerals. They brought in new crops: orange, lemon, peach, fig, sugarcane, dates, ginger, pomegranates. Most of those eventually made their way to us. That's why we have a lot of those. Saffron was also part of them. Now, cotton obviously was something that's been around for a while. Silk, rice, those things have been around a while, but they were brought to Spain, and they're still part of their main products today. And it's hard to talk about Northern African ancient history without talking about Mansa Musa. I mentioned Mali and Timbuktu and things, and so this dude was. If you think Bill Gates and all those guys are rich, this guy put them to shame. He made a legend. One of the highlights is he made a legendary uh, pilgrimage to Mecca, and he brought 60,000 people with him, and would basically every town he visited, just he would dump money on them as a part of this pilgrimage, and it was kind of a crazy, crazy famous thing. Now, take a time, pause the video here, and watch this in the slideshow. And here we go. Come on. Oh, doesn't want to cooperate. There we go. So now we're on to religion. So we're getting close to the end here, and I apologize. The two systems don't want to work very well. So I have a presenting system and my slideshow system are having trouble. So we did talk about Islam a little bit, but there are some traditional religions, and you saw that map where there's some more traditional religions. So about 10% still practice some sort of traditional religion. So we had the Islam come in around 600 after, or 660 CE, after the death of Muhammad and the expansion of that. And the Christian populations were mostly due to the colonization. So when, say, France and Portugal and those started to colonize, then they brought the Christian religion with them. But again, going back to the traditional religions, so there were some, there was a few religions that believed in supreme God. Some of them believed in nature spirits. There was some sacrifice. You've heard of, say, South American cultures where they sacrifice things. Most of them were small, food or drink. Maybe a cow or a goat or something. There were supposedly some instances of human sacrifice. I'm a little dubious, but maybe it depends on where you're at and how far you go back and maybe the area. But I'm a little bit dubious of that. But I did include it because everybody goes, "Ooh," But there is some scholars that believe that there was human sacrifice in some of especially in the eastern central parts. There's some more remote tribes and things like that. A lot of times there's rites of passages. So maybe if a male wanted to become an adult, they'd have to go out into the jungle or out into the wilderness and do some sort of task. there were pretty big rituals around marriage, especially when people died. There was usually pretty big rituals that went along with that in their traditional religions. But again, this is not something that's practiced widely. A lot of times it's in more central areas where they've been a little bit more separated, I guess would be the best way to put it. Um, you know what? I'm not. You can read through this. This was part of a. Yeah, you can read through that. So there are some things that have come through. Like even little sayings where we talk about luck or having a good day. Hello, things like that. Those kind of things have carried through as part of their traditional African things. So, they're still, they would ask for rain, and they have a spirit where they sometimes talk about rain. Um, yeah. So I'm not going to get too into that because it's 10% of the people now. Um, Back then, back then it was so diverse that everything to say that everything was like this, it'd be a disservice to them. But there were people that believed in rainmakers and believed in rituals that would bring rain, things like that. All right, so that's the slideshow. I apologize; it got a little long. If you have any questions, give me a call or email me. And we got about 2 more modules, 2 more weeks of Africa. So next one is kind of talking about colonial times, and then the next one after that we talk about um, contemporary Africa. So and that'll wrap up Africa, and that lasts us through the February break. So again, if you have any questions, give me a call. Take care. Stay safe.